Welcome back to StoryToob. Let's talk about some books.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Books we read in August. As we have become known on our channel, August was a bit of an eclectic month, as every month realistically is for us. A bit of everything thrown into this wrap up, I think.
Yeah, well, my August was a bit of a comfort month.
Comfort month.
Yeah, I did a lot of rereading. I read 5 books, 3 of them were rereads. I also read primarily in the first half of August, because in the second half of August I had other things on my mind. I had my best friend over, and we had a bit of a themed week. It was great.
Niall Horan.
This is your sign to go indulge in your hobby that brings you joy. So
Comfort reads and joyful things, and do not be ashamed of anything that you find comfort in. Anyway, August also slowed down a little bit in the second half of the month for me, just because I started a new job, learning the ropes, all of that sort of stuff. And it's very fun, but also it was very physically exhausting, which was nice. But anyway, we also, in the last day of August and the first week of September, had a very special visit from a very special couple of friends. Jimmy from the Fantasy Network and his lovely wife, Kelsey, came over to Ireland. They landed in Dublin and we hosted them and brought them around Ireland for a week. Well, they're on the East Coast. So yeah, no reading was done there either.
No.
But we'll save that for the September wrap-up. Anyway, books.
Book.
Book.
The first book I read in August was The Spy Who Came In From the Cold by John Le Carre, which was the crime book club pick for last month. And it was also my first John Le Carre novel. So it's a Smiley novel, who is his spy character, I suppose. But you don't have to read them in order. It's not the first one, but I had heard that it's a good jumping on point and just one of his best books, and I absolutely loved it. It's a Cold War spy thriller, very low on action, but he just builds tension through dialogue and through very slowly unraveling what is actually going on, and he's quite well known and praised for being very realistic in terms of what the spy craft is like. So there's not like big action hero movie type moments. It's very low key. But I absolutely loved it. I thought it was great. I read it very, very quickly in like 2 days, 2 sittings basically. And it had me glued to the page. I thought it was very easy to read and just very, very interesting. However, you kind of had the opposite experience.
Yes, so I also read it for the book club. I did the second half on audio because I found I was sort of struggling to get through it a little bit. I think the beginning I was very in, although the first chapter I didn't know what the fuck was going on. Found it slightly confusing, but I think purposefully you don't know who's doing what, and that's sort of meant to unravel, which is fine. I'm okay with that. But I just never got to the point of caring about all of the scheming and games and people playing each other, and are they playing each other and why are they playing each other. I never really got invested in that sort of plot unfolding. I found myself quite cold and detached from it all.
So would you say you never came in from the cold?
I never came in from the cold, actually. Nice. I did like the atmospheric writing. There's nothing quite like 1950s Berlin during the Cold War. Very distinct sense of time and place. I will read more John Le Carre. I'm very intrigued to try The Night Manager or Call for the Dead.
Oh, that's the first Smiley.
Yeah, just to sample a little bit more of his stuff. I just found this one, quite frankly, a little boring.
That makes me sad.
Yeah.
It's funny because we obviously had a discussion about it in our book club, and we compared it to Mick Herron and his Slow Horses or Slow House series. Like, you can see the influence of John Le Carre on Mick Herron, and you had a similar problem with that book, that you found it confusing and just a bit detached and maybe even repetitive, and I loved it. So it's interesting. Maybe there's like a stylistic choice in both of those that you're just not clicking with?
Possibly. I mean, not that I need action either, but maybe I am just sort of conditioned for liking my political thrillers with a little more chasing.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, it depends, because like I'm the same. I like no action in books, but no action in Robin Hobb really works for me, and then no action in Daniel Abraham doesn't.
Well, you see, the idea of this book, the whole tension and who's playing who, is something that's really my cup of tea. I just, for whatever reason, never cared.
Yeah.
Which
Sometimes that happens.
that tension will then disappear if you don't care.
It's the moment it plants the seed of doubt in you of like, oh, I don't think I care. It's very difficult to gain that back.
Yeah.
So.
But I think I liked the setup. I liked establishing that we were taking this sort of has-been spy, bringing him in from the cold, and sending him off on one last kind of double agent mission. And everything that he was sort of doing, this being sort of a setup, he kind of exiles himself, but it's all part of the plan. I found all that quite compelling in the first half. And he starts to work in a library. I think that was my favorite part of the book. But after that, there was just... And now I fell in love with this woman, and then I'm going to leave this woman. And then we're going to travel to this place, and this person is going to pick me up, and this person is going to interrogate me, but we don't know who this person is and why they're interrogating this person. And then we move on and we chat to another person who is also interrogating, and then there was just a lot of conversations I didn't care about. So, yeah, that's kind of how I felt with John Le Carre. He's a legend. I've tried to read him in the past as a teenager and also struggled. But I will try again, and maybe if I don't dig The Night Manager or the first Smiley novel, then maybe John Le Carre just isn't for me.
I really liked the aspect of it that it's the spy is not necessarily the hero, or nobody's necessarily a hero. And I don't mean this in a morally grey character kind of way.
I did like that.
Yeah, but more in terms of like countries, governments spying on each other. There's no good guys and bad guys necessarily.
I like the aspect.
Kind of doing the same.
Yeah, I like the aspect of the countries will treat their assets like shit. Everybody is getting the short end of the stick in terms of intelligence work. I like that. But yeah, I just didn't connect with it.
Oh well, it happens.
Well, first major book I read in September is a massive gap in my reading oeuvre, to use a fancy word, my repertoire. That was 1984 by George Orwell.
I haven't killed anybody since 1984.
So this was a fun read. This was a buddy read with Dan from Black and Blue Collar Reader. I started this a couple of days before Dan started it, before we had sort of arranged to start it, and I blasted through like half the book in a day. And then I said, okay, I'm going to wait for you, Dan.
You're not usually the person that does that.
I never do that. I'm always getting dusted in buddy reads. But then to pair it along, I also downloaded the Audible ad on YouTube that never shuts up and tells you 1984, Tom Hardy, Andrew Garfield, the radio dramatization of it. And because I like audio plays and I have a background in that myself, having written a few and starred in a few, I downloaded that. So I listened to that paired with reading the rest of the book. And I also downloaded the Stephen Fry narration just to see how he does it, because it's Stephen Fry. So I was 1984ing for like the first 2 weeks of August, and I thought it was great. There are aspects of it that I think, I mean, obviously he has this prescient notion of the control of language and the sort of dumbing down of language, which I think is the best thing about it. And obviously this whole totalitarian state, the ever watchful Big Brother, is a sort of a universal concept known at this point. I find personally some of it maybe didn't age just with how technology has evolved and social media and the spread of information, that maybe it's corporations that might be doing this more subtly rather than the very overt totalitarian government states that are doing it in the book. But I don't think I can fault that because he wrote it in 1949 before any of that stuff existed. So, yeah, it's a really cool book. I think just some elements of it feel a little over the top because of where we are now as a society, but that just makes it more interesting to read as well. He wrote it right after World War II. You can imagine maybe this could have been a possibility with, you know, if World War II ended differently. Editing me wanted to make a point. What was my point?
You had a point about endings.
Oh, I also like that 1984 does not have a happy ending, mainly because I feel like happy endings would undercut the dystopian nature of your dystopian book, and dystopian books kind of rely on the ending not being happy. And that's it. It's a very interesting book. It's a classic for a reason. It's George Orwell, and now I'm allowed to call things Orwellian.
That is what happens, yeah. They give you a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And they say, is allowed to call things Orwellian.
Yeah. Well, I had read Animal Farm before, but I mean, I don't know if I can call things, I think Orwellian is more the term related to 1984. Anyway, 1984 was good. What do you want me to say? George Orwell was shit? No.
I haven't killed anybody since 1984.
I'm glad you loved it.
Cool.
I also did. I read it as an edgy teenager.
Oh, yeah.
Which I feel like...
I think next on my list now will be We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, because I want to see where George Orwell got all his ideas.
Absolutely. Yeah, be curious about that. Okay, so my next read was my first reread. And if you remember, I think I mentioned this actually in the wrap-up of the month before of July, that I had reread The Infernal Devices and started another Cassandra Clare book. So I read Lady Midnight, which is the first Dark Artifices.
Artifices. Artifices.
Yeah, whatever it is. Book. So that is her last trilogy chronologically within the Shadowhunter Chronicles. It's set in, or begins in 2012 LA. And I think I might have read this book twice before. This could have been the third time, but the other two I've only read once. So very excited for that. And I enjoyed it immensely. I think this might be, in terms of her writing, probably her best. But I still like The Infernal Devices more just because of the setting and the characters and how attached I am to it. But I enjoyed this reread a lot. I really, really loved it. And I think the two main characters, but the rest of the cast as well, to be honest, are really great. So I don't have that much more to say about it. Yeah, it was great to reread a Shadowhunter book that I don't know like the back of my hand, the way I do the 6 Mortal Instruments books and the 3 Infernal Devices. So it was, actually this all came about obviously because I was reading Infernal Devices and I wanted more, but also because I participated in Cassandra Clare's Kickstarter last year, which was Seasons of Shadowhunters, and I received the first book, which is The Secrets of Blackthorn Hall, which is set, I think, 13 months after The Dark Artifices. So I wanted to reread them before reading The Secrets of Blackthorn Hall. The Secrets of Blackthorn Hall, because I remember in very broad strokes how it ends, but not the specifics, and I think book 3 got pretty wild. So anyway, that was my second read.
So I've been entering a little bit of a post-apocalyptic kick or phase lately, and I've got a couple lined up. I just sort of went for one that's been sitting on the shelf for a good while, an author that I've wanted to try for a long time, and it just worked wonderfully for me. I read The Chrysalids by John Wyndham, which I thought was rather delightful. This is a very dark book, but written in such a charming, accessible way with deceptively beautiful writing that it just sort of breezed by. I read it real quick, and then I was about halfway through when I messaged our friend Joseph from Joseph Reads Books. I was like, Joe, I think you'd like this, which has been a theme with our buddy reads this year, where I just messaged Joe halfway through a book going, I think you'd like this, and then he reads it and finishes it before I do. And I can't remember who finishes first, but anyway, it's not a competition. I saw so much influence on Stan Lee and Jack Kirby for the X-Men here. This was written a good 10 years before, and it was written 10 years after World War II, so I thought maybe there was a lot of allegory here about the treatment of Jewish people in Europe in the 1940s. Here, we're, I don't know how long after a nuclear holocaust, people are a little different. But here we follow a young boy, it's kind of a coming-of-age story as well, a young boy living in a very religious society of normal people. And there are aberrations, there are mutants, they're called. Basically, people that have been born with an extra toe or, you know, little deformities that just make them stand out or make them a little bit different, effects of radiation, all this kind of stuff. And David begins to realize that he has telepathic powers and that he is connected on a higher form of consciousness to other children in this village and potentially from further away. And then it becomes this little X-Men story, a little bit, of people just hiding. And we've got our own little Magneto figure in there, and maybe a Professor X figure. It's quite dark, but it's very charming to read, and I really, really enjoyed John Wyndham's style, and I will be reading more. I have 2 other ones there, ready to go. But it was exactly what I wanted. In that moment, I was looking for something post-apocalyptic. I've got a couple more now that I've got my eye on to read before the end of the year. Lee Brackett being one of them. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one, and I would recommend it to you. And if you're a comic fan, if you're a fan of the X-Men, it might be interesting to give this a try and see potentially some of the influence. There's some very overt influences here that makes me think that maybe Stan Lee and Jack Kirby read this book and decided to take the ideas and turn them into superheroes. Anyway, very, very cool. Lots of allegory as well for the Holocaust, post-Holocaust treatment of Jews. This idea of natural selection and the sort of superior race. But then that idea in the X-Men as well of the Homo superior supplanting the Homo sapiens. All very interesting stuff. And a very cool setting. It's like Canada, basically. Anyway, cool book.
Well, I think you can probably guess what my next book was after Lady Midnight. I read Lord of Shadows, which is the sequel to Lady Midnight. So this one I definitely only read once because these came out when I was a little bit older and I was in college and I was in a phase of being a bit pretentious. As you do. Yeah, as you do. So I did read it. I couldn't resist, but I was, not really advertising that I was reading it. Anyway, I was dumb. So this was really, really fun to reread because I couldn't remember what parts of the story happened in book 2 and what parts of the story happened in book 3. So now I have a more solid idea of anything that hasn't happened yet is in the 3rd book, which I haven't read. I did not read that one this month. That is not my 3rd reread. So yeah, I will be reading the 3rd one sooner rather than later. Probably not in September because it's the month of Evie, but maybe after that. And I continue to have a great time with these books. I love them dearly. I don't really have anything else to say about that.
Well, I'm not going to say too much about my next read because I have a 32-minute video that you can go watch where I go all in depth. 11 minutes of which are non-spoiler. Maybe if you've been following the channel, you'll know I finished Midnight Tides by Stephen Erickson, which maybe if you're to ask me objectively what's the best book in Malazan so far of the first 5, I would maybe say this one. Is it my favorite? I don't know. Memories of Ice is still. It was just an experience. But this one is the most Shakespearean, and I feel like he's been really reaching for that in the 4 books leading up to this one and trying to do his Shakespearean tragedy, but I think he got all the ingredients right in this one. This is the most self-contained book so far. It kind of feels like a standalone in a lot of respects. That doesn't mean to say that I think you can jump in here, honestly, you could probably read this book without reading the other four and still get a good bit out of it. But there's a lot of context built into the sort of weaves in this one. But the Shakespearean aspect just made it grandiose and thespian and just dramatic. The final scene is in a throne room with all these brothers just betraying each other. No spoilers at all, but it's just betrayals and poisoning and people trying to secretly gain control of power in, a sort of corrupt city. It's all very theatrical and Shakespeare. This is it. But also centered around family drama, and we have the two sets of brothers from the two sort of warring nations, and you get all of their internal family dynamics on each side, and then when everything comes together in typical Erikson fashion, the convergence of all of these plot threads, it just increases the tension and the dramatics of it all. I feel like he just nailed it with Midnight Tides, and I think it's his tightest book so far, and I had a great time. It took me a while to read, but I think if you take your time with these books, it makes you savor the experience. Anyway, go watch my review if you want more of that.
So the next book I finished in August, speaking of kind of reading it over a longer period of time, was Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. And this was a bit of a random one, but if you watched our last month's wrap up, I read The Castle of Otranto, which was or is credited to be the first Gothic revival novel from the 18th century, and I really loved that. And one of my incentives to pick that up was that it's one of the books that Tessa loves that she loves in The Infernal Devices. And I have a list of all the books that are mentioned and like discussed by the main characters, and I want to read them. And another one of them was Lady Audley's Secret. So that was kind of the excuse to pick it up.
You also have a very good video about the Castle of Otranto and Gothic fiction.
Check it out.
Linked somewhere below.
And this is a Victorian sensation novel or a scandal novel. And it is essentially what that means. It's a kind of a proto-thriller and a proto-domestic thriller. So to put it in contemporary terms, Lady Audley's secret walked so Gone Girl could run.
Nice.
So basically we have, family drama and scandal and people disappearing and twists and like, is somebody secretly alive when we thought they were dead and that kind of thing. But it's also Victorian, so people are visiting each other in the countryside.
And drinking tea
and staying in inns, and it's quite slow because they're taking walks through gardens and that kind of thing. So it was really lovely. I actually really, really enjoyed it. And towards the middle maybe, I was like, okay, I think I know where we're going. Let's get there. But then it did surprise me with some things. So I enjoyed it a lot. I hadn't read something from that time period in a while, but I really enjoyed that aesthetic. We are more on the countryside, so like I should probably say what this is actually about. So Lady Audley is the new wife of Robert Audley, who has an estate, and you know the drill. And she's like young and pretty and everybody loves her, except for Robert Audley's daughter, who doesn't really trust her. And then our main character has a best friend who he brings to visit his uncle. The main character is the nephew. And the friend disappears under mysterious circumstances. And there might be some fake identity at play. There might be some bigamy at play. Anyway, it's a really fun book. If you enjoy Victorian fiction and the prose style that comes with it, I think there's no reason for you to not enjoy it. Mary Elizabeth Braddon wrote a ton of novels. They're not all in print anymore. She published this when she was 27, and it was so successful that she was rich for life based
Nice.
on this. So she was very successful in her lifetime.
The dream.
The dream, honestly, yeah. And it made me want to read Wilkie Collins, actually, who The Moonstone and The Lady in White, I think, is the title. Because
The Woman in White?
The Woman in White, yeah. That's the one. Because he is credited with that being like the first mystery novel. And it's also Victorian, but I think it's more set in the city. So I have been wanting to read him for years because he was very, very successful at the same time as Charles Dickens, but he has survived a little bit less than Dickens. So
Yeah.
I've always been intrigued by that. But anyway, Lady Audley's Secret, not a classic that gets talked about a lot or that I had really ever heard of before, but one that I really enjoyed and that I'm glad I read. I've been enjoying this little
Cool.
dipping into slightly more obscure classics thing.
When we get around to the eventual top 10 books of the year, it's going to be very difficult for me to do that. I may need a top 15. She won't allow it because I must follow the rules. Anyway, the next book I read and most recently finished is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, which is so eloquently simple. It's 150 pages. There is so much complexity wrapped underneath efficient simplicity in this book that you could think about it for days, weeks, months, years on end. And it's just an extremely interesting and important book, and the time period it was written in was very interesting, and the fact that James Baldwin wrote it when he wrote it is interesting. James Baldwin was a gay black man living in the 50s. He was American. He wrote this while he was living in Paris, which maybe there's a stereotype in America that Paris is this loose, sort of anything goes, city of love. There's that sort of notion of Europe being that as well. Not quite true, but there is a certain romanticism to Paris that certainly permeates this book, and it's very stylish. It's a very stylish book, simply so. But we follow a bisexual love triangle. We follow what is a gay man who is sort of confused, doesn't know what he wants, has escaped America, quite literally run away from a gay experience, a gay sexual experience that he has in America, and fled to Europe, to Paris. He's engaged to an American woman who was off traveling in Spain for reasons we don't really know. And he starts up a love affair with an Italian man called Giovanni. And he stays in Giovanni's room for several months. And things get very complicated. There's a mystery at the heart of it all. And I think this book is about, obviously exploring sexuality. It's also about looking at internalized homophobia, even from gay people, which I think James Baldwin felt very strongly about and wrote it with real grace. And it's also about making decisions and taking control of your life rather than going with the wind, sort of plodding along. And there's a lot of very interesting passages about that, and he puts very complex feelings that you may not be able to verbalize. He puts them very simply, very beautifully down on the page, and it just sort of makes you want to keep reading how he expresses his views about life and the world and all that kind of thing. It's a really, really good book, and I would recommend it to just about anybody. If it doesn't sound like a cup of tea, it may not be your cup of tea. Like, it's exactly what it says on the tin. But yeah, I think just the time period, James Baldwin is interesting. This is just beautifully written. And again, I also wanted to read James Baldwin this year for my American fiction project. I was actually going to read another one, like If Beale Street Could Talk, because it's set in America. It's kind of more directly about, racism in America and that sort of tackling those notions that I'd be interested in hearing from James Baldwin. But this one was also a very American book. The sort of culture clash between America and Europe, still very interesting to read about here. And it was also interesting that he chose to write about a sort of privileged white man discovering his sexuality instead of writing from a black perspective. And he sort of treated it with not any bias or prejudice or anything like that. The main character is kind of lost and casually cruel, and he pulls people into this pit, even though I don't think he means to. He never makes us think or tells us to think that this guy is evil and he's really bad. It's just he's a bit empty and lost, and maybe the world being the way it is made him that way. And it's very interesting. It's a really, really, really good book.
So everything that I've talked about so far, I read in the first about 2.5 weeks of August. And then my best friend and cousin came over for a week, and we went to 2 Niall Horan concerts, which we had tickets for almost a year.
Yeah.
And it was amazing, and it was a great week, and I miss her. So after that, that kind of thrust me into a post-concert, post-vacation, even though I wasn't the one on vacation, existential crisis. And I couldn't concentrate on reading anything. So I needed something comforting. And I have been wanting to reread this book since I read it for the first time in December of last year. And that is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. I adore this book. It actually ended up being quite timely because I just found out yesterday that on Monday we are hearing what Emily Henry's next book is going to be titled, coming out at some point next year. Very excited for that. But yeah, Book Lovers is wonderful. I love it. I love the main characters. I love how it unfolds. I read it in one day. I started in the morning. I was off work, and I finished sometime in the early evening. And I didn't do anything else in the meantime. And then I finished it, and I started flicking through it, rereading favorite paragraphs. And I think this is one of my favorite books of all time.
Cool.
And there are some flaws that you can point out, but I just don't care. So
Nice.
I loved my reread. I think I might have loved it even more than the first time. Maybe because the first time I was not quite ready to admit that a contemporary romance book is one of my favorite books, but it is. That was my last read of August. Did you have any more? No.
Well, I'm halfway through. If people who like The Expanse want to know how I'm getting on with The Expanse, I'm halfway through Babylon's Ashes. I'm taking it pretty slow. I'm actually I'm listening a little bit to the audiobook while I'm in work, doing a few monotonous tasks like lifting boxes around the place. So I'm halfway through that, and it's a little scattered so far, Babylon's Ashes. I'm also reading it physically along with it whenever I get the chance. And it's a little scattered so far. There's a lot of POVs in Babylon's Ashes. Some of them I'm not sure I really care about. But when Bobby and Avasarala are around, life is good. There was also a very touching scene with Holden and his family on Earth, all his moms and dads. That was very, very nice. So a lot of those scenes kind of, just with the characters I've grown to love, that bring a smile to your face. I'm not really sure necessarily what the book is actually about plot-wise, even though, The Expanse is usually quite plot-driven. Okay, so there's a sort of a contained plot in each book. Babylon's Ashes feels a little scattered at the moment. But yeah, Bobby is back on the Rosie with the crew. I love it. They're always in contact with Avasarala, who also has her own POVs again, finally. And it's just... It's The Expanse. I love The Expanse. It's good. Anything else? Are you halfway through anything? Or?
No, I'm not. I've been incapable of reading more than like 2 pages in one go. I did start Persuasion by Jane Austen for the month of Evie. I'm about 50 pages in.
I will be starting Happy Place by Emily Henry.
Yes. But yeah, I have not retained much, if I'm being completely honest, because my attention span has not been all there. But we'll get there.
Well, we've had Jimmy and Kelsey over for the last week as well, so
yeah, and now we're sad.
Not a whole lot of reading. Yeah, we love and miss you guys.
Yeah, please come back. So, what was your book of the month?
I don't know. I mean, Midnight Tides is Midnight Tides. Giovanni's Room is Giovanni's Room, and
Wow.
the Chrysalids is the Chrysalids. I don't know.
That's very insightful.
Yeah. They're three very different books. I can't, like, how do you compare those books? I was reading Midnight Tides for 2 months, so I didn't necessarily think of it as an August book. I finished it in, like, the first week of August. It was more of a July book.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it would be either Giovanni's Room or the Chrysalids, I guess. And I think maybe Giovanni's Room.
Oh,
Yeah.
very cool.
Yeah. But I kind of loved everything except for the Le Carre.
Well, that's funny because that's my book of the month.
That's nice.
Because we're discounting rereads, so I really only have 2 candidates, and I enjoyed both of them. And it's A Spy Who Came In From the Cold.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very nice. So September, if you have been following the channel, will be dedicated to Evie from She Was Only Evie. We're going to be reading a bunch of Evie books. I'm going to start with Happy Place by Emily Henry. And I'm reading a few things as well on the side. I'm going to be reading A Star Called Henry by Roddy Doyle, which is a Roddy Doyle book that I have not read yet and probably should, because it's about a lot of things that are very close to my heart. And he's one of my favourite writers. So I'll be doing that, and then all the Evie books, whatever we get to. We'll try to prioritise The Spear Cuts Through Water because it's Evie.
Yeah.
I don't know how much fantasy I'll want to read this month, but thankfully Evie's taste in books is very broad, and we like that. So we may also stretch out the month of Evie an extra couple of weeks.
Yeah, we might.
Just to give us a bit of breathing room, and we don't want to constrain ourselves and pressure ourselves with time frames and all this kind of stuff. We just want to enjoy the books that we want to read, and we've been busy the last few weeks. So yeah, what are you picking up for? Yo, you're on Persuasion.
I'm on Persuasion. Same thing. Spear Cuts Through Water will be prioritized, and I will also be buddy reading Sunny Place for Shady People by Mariana Enriquez, which is coming out, I think, on the 17th of September in English. So whenever Evie has that in her hands and is ready to go, we'll be buddy reading that, which will double up for Short Stories September.
Oh yes, yeah. And I will be reading with Evie some Johnny Boy Steinbeck short stories. The Long Valley is the collection that we will be reading for Short Story September.
Yeah, and if you want to know what else is on our TBR in the pot of possibilities for the month of Evie, just go check out our video. That's it.
Let's wrap it up.
How was your August? Did you have any new favorites? Any books that you want to share? Have you read the books that we've read this last month? Let us know your thoughts in the comments as always, and we'll chat to you there. And until then, thank you for watching.
Bye.
The Spy Who Came In From... I'm just going to do that again.
Cool.
The first book I read in... I was about to say September again.
Fuck's sake.
The first book I read in August.
Get your shit together.
Oh my god.